Okay. Looks like the recording has started, so it looks like there's a countdown for that recording. I'll just wait a little bit. Okay. Um, so hello, New York. I see you guys are all eating lunch. That's wonderful. Um, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So I know if I start yelling really loud, just tell me that I'm too loud because I have a tendency to yell when I'm on the phone. I don't know why. But um, my name is Luke Zimmerman. I am the Workforce Engagement Manager for Central and Southern Illinois. Um, so pretty much my region consists of there's two regions in Illinois, Chicago and everything south of it for the American Red Cross. So my region is everything south of Chicago. So I think our regions are probably pretty similar from what I've heard. With we don't have one large metro area that we operate in. We have a lot of smaller out between a lot of rural areas. So we have about 78 counties that consist of part of southeast Iowa and then northeast Missouri. And we have about 10 disaster paid staff. And again, the talk today is just going to be about what's workforce engagement mean, and how can we make sense of it? Because if we don't understand it, how are we going to expect to be able to provide a good program for new volunteers?
Oh, hang on. You're just breaking up a bit. Hang on.
Am I breaking up a little bit?
Yeah, hang on.
You guys are breaking up too.
Hold on. I'm trying to get rid of some of this stuff here and make sure our internet's.
There you go. I didn't say that, but I caught it.
Okay.
45 minutes of trying to get the system.
Okay. Can you hear us now?
Yep.
Okay.
Can you guys see me moving around?
Yeah, we can
Is
see
that
you.
happening? Okay. It's exciting.
Okay, so yeah, keep going. Sorry.
Okay. So what's everybody having for lunch? I'm kind of curious. What do we got? I see some
Cookies.
cookies,
Chili.
salad. Yeah, I've heard about the Julie salad. It's a pretty big deal. But okay, well, anyway, so pretty much, I've been in this role. I've worked for the Red Cross for about 3 years. Out of that 3 years, I was a little old disaster program specialist that kind of had my little chunk of the world, and so I did full cycle. So preparedness, respond, and recover. I did everything in that like 12 county area for the Red Cross and Disaster Services. I did that for about a year and a half, 2 years-ish, and then I've been in this job for a little over a year as a workforce engagement manager. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't know if I should maybe talk slower.
No. It's New York, not
Okay.
Illinois. We talk fast.
Yeah, okay. That's true. A little bit of draw, I guess. We take our time with our speech, but so pretty much what workforce engagement is, what I've decided is it's a way that we can put a term on something that we've always done for the past 20, 30, 40 years. But we're trying to identify it in a way that makes sense, right? Whenever I give talks on how do you onboard a new volunteer, how do you train an existing or a new volunteer, how do you deploy somebody, none of that stuff is new. It's always happened. New volunteers. We've always trained volunteers. We've always deployed people. But we're trying to identify it and get more scripted with it to the point where we can have a specific position like a workforce team that they can understand their clear roles and responsibilities. We kind of struggle in a lot is we ask volunteers, hey, do workforce engagement with us. Okay, well, what does that mean, right? Let's make sense of it. Let's not just keep talking of onboarding and placement and leadership development and recognition and appreciation, but how, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. That doesn't work so good, and we're working on developing. So again, headquarters decided what workforce engagement is it's really broken down into 7.
This one?
There's Julie running around. I see her.
Sorry, I'm trying to get us hardwired so that way it's a little less spotty. Dwayne?
That's okay. Yeah.
Dwayne, is this it?
So do you want me to wait? You may keep talking? I can keep talking.
I mean, how are you guys feeling? Are you still getting the gist of what he's saying?
Most of it.
Most of it? Okay. Sorry, you can keep going, but we might have to ask questions because we are a little spotty, but we're getting someone to hardwire us. Did you catch that?
But
Can you hear me now?
All right, hang tight. We're getting somebody to hardwire us to hopefully fix this.
We can't hear you, but we saw that you had a drink off.
do you want me to keep talking, Julie, or hold off right now?
Hang on 1 second. We're going to get somebody to hardwire.
Okay. Perfect.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine.
See, when we tried this yesterday in my office, it worked fine. But, of course, when you come in the boardroom, that's when it decides not to work. You guys know each other. That just means more time to grab more cookies.
I could really go for some cookies right now. Not gonna lie.
We could hold it in front of you and make you really feel bad.
Yeah, that would. But I guess it's better than nothing. But I got an orange. Compared to a cookie. Unfortunately.
Sorry, guys. Thank you for being patient.
That's okay. So this is what New York looks like. Am I looking at New York right now?
Yeah. Yep, this is it. This is all we got.
This is New York.
Yes.
I like it.
Outside of New York, it's everybody knows the city, and no one knows the rest of the state. Just like Illinois, everybody knows Chicago, don't know anything.
Yep. Yeah. I was gonna say I'm from Illinois, which is also known as Chicago and everything else. And I'm part of everything else. What was that?
I was saying recently they needed data on training in New York, so they asked the Greater New York Region for the training on March 6th, information on March 6th.
Oh my goodness.
And then on March 18th, they realized it was the rest of New York.
But I'm from Southern Illinois myself.
Cairo or Carol, depending on.
Carol, Carol like the syrup.
Yep.
My mom's still there.
Oh,
we're wired now.
oh, that's nice.
Let me make sure that we're recording. Hopefully this. Oh, it's still recording. Okay.
I'll
You gonna
keep
play this
that
back for
cord.
something?
I'll get it from you next time I'm in town.
Thank you.
Don't lose it.
We'll not lose it. We'll go in my office. Okay.
Okay. Are we ready to learn about amazing workforce engagement stuff now?
Yes.
All right. So to kind of pick up where we left off, I think this is where we left off, but we were talking about what technically is encompassing in workforce engagement, right? A lot of people think because it has the term engagement in there that it means everything, right? Because engagement is a very, very broad word. But technically, the Red Cross has identified it in 7 distinct areas. So the first, and if you kind of think of it this way, this is what they call the engagement cycle, right? The volunteer cycle that a volunteer goes through from beginning to having an existing relationship with the Red Cross and volunteering to developing as a leader, right? So first and foremost is onboarding and placement, right? Pretty much what that means is when a volunteer, a brand new volunteer, gets interviewed, approved, they find out what they want to do, and then they get their initial steps, right? To be as clear and as simple as possible, that's what onboarding and placement means, right? If they're interested in DAT, identifying what the training requirements are, who their supervisor is, getting them orientated to the Red Cross, getting them orientated to the region, to disaster services, to their supervisors, and kind of helping them along that initial pathway, right? Next is engagement. And engagement, again, how I like to think of it is it makes sense to me with the logistics L, right? How there's a big logistics L, which stands for everything else under logistics, including DST, staff services, so on and so forth. And then there's also a little logistics L, which strictly means logistics. And it's kind of the same thing with engagement. There's a big engagement E, which means the workforce engagement manager, the workforce engagement team. That encompasses all 7 of these areas. But it's also the little engagement E, which specifically looks at how an existing volunteer is getting engaged, right? Are they active? Are they satisfied? And it could be, are they involved in the way that they want to be involved? A lot of times we look at metrics and certain criteria where volunteers have to enter so many hours, they have to take so many trainings, they have to be involved in DAT or home fire campaign or pillowcase. But at the end of the day, I have children, right? 4.5 and then twin girls that are about 20 months, okay? If I wasn't working for the Red Cross, I would want to volunteer, right? Because I kind of like the organization. But having 3 children, and if I had another job somewhere else, it would be hard for me to give that much time, right? So what I would want to do is having that conversation with my region, my workforce engagement manager as I'm coming on, saying, hey, listen, I want to be available. I want to take some trainings as I'm available. I don't have time for DAT. I don't have time for home fire campaign, but I want to take trainings, stay involved, attend some occasional meetings, and when my life changes in the future, right, I'll be ready, okay? You won't have to re-onboard me, retrain me. I can be available to deploy, to respond, right? And that's engagement for me, right? That means I'm engaged in the way that I want to be engaged, okay? So a lot of it is, can we somehow have a volunteer, can we meet the volunteer where they're at? Or do we want to have the volunteer meet us where we're at, right? And sometimes it's meeting in the middle a little bit. But if we're making a few steps of making it as easy as possible for a volunteer to volunteer, that's going to be successful, right? I've thought about this for a while, and for an organization that, like the Red Cross, that really 90+% of the work that we do is done by volunteers, right? And I'm speaking to an entire room of them. Why do we make it so hard for volunteers to volunteer? Right? I know that we have standards, we have procedures, it's a complex thing to respond to a disaster, and I get that. But maybe there's some things that we can do differently to make it a little bit easier for someone to get engaged, a little bit easier for someone to get involved, right? And it's at any level. A brand new volunteer, it's really hard. You know, they got to go through some regional entry point at Volunteer Connection. They have to talk to a bunch of people. Then they come to disaster. They have to have an email account. They have to get on Volunteer Connection and figure that out. And then they have to understand what disaster is, right? So then they have to understand all the gaps and what they want to do. And they're communicating to dozens of different people at any point in time. And it's just very chaotic for them, right? But also going to existing volunteers, right? I'm looking at a room of a lot of, existing experienced volunteers, and it's still hard to volunteer, right? It doesn't get easier. The more you get involved, the more you get engaged, you come up with certain roadblocks, right? I was just talking to our division disaster executive, Dave Gutierrez. He has a volunteer partner named Cheryl. And she was talking to me about this because she was saying even though she's the volunteer partner for the division disaster executive, right? So the #1 guy in our entire North Central division, she's still not able to get a T card, right? They have her traveling across numerous different states, and she can't get a T card to pay for hotels, to pay for meals. So she has to continually fill out receipt reimbursement forms, right? So with workforce engagement, it's really, really good. I always make sure it's always at the beginning and the end of everything I say and do is what we're doing, what we're implementing, what tools we're creating. The purpose of it should always be, is it going to make the volunteer experience easier, right? Because once we go down that road of not having that be in the forefront of our mind, we can create some extremely complex tool that makes sense to us, but to new volunteers, somewhat existing volunteers, it's a lot to swallow all at once, right? Now, if you have a brand new volunteer and then you show them the new gap chart and you say, okay, let's talk about which one of the 20-some different gaps you want to do, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in, right? So just think about that kind of as we go through the presentation. So then after engagement, we have training. And we all know what training is, but that also falls under workforce engagement. After training, you have recognition and appreciation. This is, it's new because we're only talking about it, but we've always done this in the past. How have we recognized and appreciated volunteers, right? How have you guys been recognized and appreciated? I don't know if you guys if I can hear you very well, but is there anything that anybody's done for any of you that has really meant something in terms of recognition and appreciation?
When I went out to the snowstorm in Buffalo in 2007, the executive director of the chapter at the time gifted everybody who came to the response from outside the area with a Greater Buffalo coffee mug filled with candy kisses. Oh. I still remember that, and when she retired, I sent her a note. I just thought that was the coolest thing.
Awesome.
We had a volunteer who went to the Virgin Islands for logistics, and they sent him a cute Virgin Islands pin with a thank you card, and he was just thrilled to death.
Yep. Awesome. Yeah, and it's so we're talking like maybe some gifts, right? Red Cross pins. There's a lot that we do that makes an impact, right? To go back to the story in 2007 with the snowstorm, that was 10 years ago, right? But it made such an impact. Maybe the cost of the mug, $5, right? If they bought them in bulk. And then, you get a bunch of Hershey's Kisses. Those aren't too expensive. So you're talking maybe $7, $8 for that. But 10 years later, that $7 or $8 investment has made a difference, right? So I know with recognition appreciation, we're always talking about money sometimes. Sometimes you can't afford those gifts, but really, it's a small investment to have some type of gift platform, whether it's mugs, whether it's hats or T-shirts or region pins. That small amount of investment can make a huge difference. 10 years later, you're still talking about that. That is, you can't measure that, right? What's that commercial with the? That's the series of commercials where they go through, like how much does it cost for a sandwich, and then how much does it cost for this, and then they get to the end, and how much does it cost to have a good meal? Priceless. You know what I'm talking about? Isn't that?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same thing that we talk with recognition appreciation. Sometimes you got to put in a lot of time and effort and a little bit of money, but at the end of the day, the outcome is priceless, right? So that's a good example for recognition appreciation. Again, right, we're just now talking about it, but they did it 10 years ago, right? That was recognition appreciation. This is nothing new. We're not reinventing the wheel. All they want to do is just call it something now, right? Because they realize it's really, really, really important, and we need to focus on it. So again, after recognition appreciation, we get into volunteer connection and profile management. It's my favorite thing to talk about. And again, that falls under workforce engagement as well. All it is trying to have clean data instead of dirty data, right? 10-15 years ago, the volunteer connection profile management role was a file cabinet with everybody's file in the file cabinet, right? That's what it was. And then as we're going into the new age, where we have volunteer connection, we have internet, we have the whole digital age, everything that used to be in a file cabinet is now supposed to be on volunteer connection, right? 10-15 years ago, man, I could hear my volunteers, my 20-30 year vets always talk about how much work it was to keep those records up to date, go through everybody's training transcripts, go through everybody's qualifications, when does their first aid CPR license expire, all of their gaps, their DSHR stuff, all that stuff was a lot of effort, right? And it's the same thing with volunteer connection management. That's all we're doing is we're updating people's records, we're updating people's profiles, making sure that we're up to date, so that way when National asks us, hey, you have 200 shelter service associates, how come you're not able to handle this disaster? And then you look at volunteer connection, it's like, well, it says I have 200, but really I have maybe 10, right? So that's where a lot of people are at. That's where we're at. We're trying to work through that. And that's just one of the areas of workforce engagement that we'll talk about. Next is leadership development. Again, that's one of those that we've always done, right? We've probably done it better in the past than we do now. I'll just kind of ask the room, is there anybody in the room that's a supervisor? Okay. How did you guys get developed as leaders?
Experience on the job, mentoring with managers and other supervisors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone said thrown in there.
So did anybody ask you guys when you were a service associate, when you were a new volunteer or an entry-level volunteer, how did somebody look at you, or did somebody say, hey, I think you're a good track to be a leader, I want to develop you to get promoted to a supervisor? And also, was it, some initial initiative of you guys saying, hey, I really want to get promoted, I'm going to handle this myself?
My executive director approached me right away about becoming a supervisor, and I held off for quite a few years.
Okay.
But then finally did.
Okay. So that was in the past, right? And I think that's one thing that we have gotten away from is right now it seems like, just from my own just what it seems like here, and it might be like that there, but it seems like we only promote or develop leaders on people that approach us, right? Because we're in that reaction phase. Someone says, hey, I want to be a supervisor. Okay, let me look at your training transcripts. Let me see what you need to take. Here's the classes you need to take, right? We've kind of lost that proactive approach where we're looking at the volunteers we have, looking at the ones that could be developed as leaders, and having some type of mentor program, right? Having the existing volunteers, the existing staff reach out to those volunteers, have that conversation, and not just having it once, right? You had a perfect example. This person talked to you about it for years, and you said no, but eventually you said yes, and then look where you're at now. If that executive director hadn't have done that, the entire room would be without an amazing volunteer. It looks like a supervisor. So that's something that we're trying to get back to, right? It might be a new term. We're calling it leadership development and workforce engagement, but it's nothing new. We've lost sight of it because of a lot that's happened the past several years. But it seems like we're trying to get back to that and look at what can we do to be more proactive to try to develop the next leaders, right? Because we all know the hardest positions to fill on any DR is leadership positions, right? Look what happened in the fall. They were taking, not even Red Cross volunteers. They needed supervisors so bad, managers, that they were taking people with just professional experience without any training and saying, if you have experience running a kitchen professionally, you can be a feeding manager for DR, right? And that's kind of scary, right? Not only for us, but for that new volunteer's initial experience, right? If we're going to set them up for failure like that, it's kind of like, is it love at first sight or loathe at first sight? It's kind of scary, right? When I was first dating my wife, they always say that honeymoon phase ends, right? Because you're really wanting to get this person to love you. You're really wanting to make sure that you're there for them, and just be able to develop some relationship at first, right? Because it's a journey that you're going to walk with them forever. And it's kind of the same thing with volunteers. We want to make sure that we're doing that very, very good initially. But again, supervisors are very, very hard to come by. And it's just because we've lost sight of leadership development, right? We have a lot of service associates. We hardly have any supervisors or managers, and it shouldn't be that hard, right? We shouldn't make it that hard for volunteers to get promoted, but we do, right? Last, that technically falls under workforce engagement is deployments, right? Staffing, all that wonderful stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis. Whenever there's a big enough disaster, how do people get deployed that are outside that region to that disaster, right? In my region, we have these volunteers called deployment officers. In the past, it's kind of fallen on just the local chapters, the local territories that just handle the entire deployment process, but they're starting to want to handle it by people that have time and can do it, right? If it was handled before by a disaster program manager or disaster program specialist, they would have to either cancel all the stuff they have planned that day, all their meetings, home fire campaign events, all that stuff. So the mission of the Red Cross, which again is not just to respond to one disaster, it's to respond to all disasters, that would kind of fall to the wayside because we had to cancel everything. Let's deploy the masses, right? So they're wanting to try to look at how can we deploy volunteers to disasters, plus be able to have people to keep the region going, make sure DAC calls are getting responded to, make sure smoke alarms are getting installed, make sure trainings are happening, make sure we're still going to meetings, we're still talking to our emergency managers and our partners. And that's the age-old question, right? What they say, the solution to everything is get a volunteer to do it, right? But I'm looking at a room of volunteers that it's, a lot harder said than done. How do you get a volunteer to do some of those things? So anyway, that's kind of workforce engagement in a nutshell, all those different functions. I'll kind of go through each function and show you guys some tools and resources of what we're using, what we're doing, how we're doing it. But before I go into that, does anybody have any questions about those 7 functions? Okay. And just to make sense of it in my mind, I know they're clear-cut, separate, but they interconnect a lot, right? Onboarding and placement, it's very similar to engagement. You can have a training conversation with a brand new volunteer as you're onboarding them. Give them the classes they need to take, assign them on Edge. That all falls in training, okay? Recognition, appreciation. That doesn't have to be something that happens at this time, right? You can recognize and appreciate a brand new volunteer, right? You made it to us so far. That's a huge success. You've made it through Volunteer Connection. You somehow made it through Volunteer Services. You've come to us. You've responded to our emails and phone calls. That's huge, right? Because that doesn't really happen a lot. So recognize them for that.
We have a volunteer services specialist in the room, so I don't appreciate that.
Well, I mean, it's great that we recognize and appreciate volunteers for the simplest things, right? We don't have to wait for someone to respond to a DAT call or get promoted or to deploy for us to say, good job, thank you, right? If they just get back to us on an email, if we send out a regional mass blast saying, hey, we need people to respond to this level 2 disaster, and they say, yep, I'm available, or even if they say, no, I'm not available, they responded, right? That's engagement, okay? I love volunteer service, so I don't. I really, really, really do. They are either your best friends or your worst enemy, right? And they're my best friends. Trust me. I have a really funny story. So I always use this example when it comes to my relationship with volunteer services, right? How the closer you are and the closer you work with volunteer services, and not just me, but also the workforce engagement team, can either make or break how hard or how easy our job is, right? So I was in the military before I joined the Red Cross, and the best advice I ever got, so I was a brand new private in the infantry. I go to my duty station. I was just a scared, nervous 19-year-old little boy. And I had this typical mean, tough, strict platoon sergeant that was just not the nicest man ever. But, you know, he would have this smile that you couldn't tell if he was smiling, right? He would just have this, and then, oh, I'm smiling. Oh, he would say he's smiling, and it's like, I could not tell that you're smiling right now. But so he pulled me aside my very first day. I'll never forget this. And he was telling me about, you know, I'm going to give you 2 people that you need to be best friends with, right, throughout your entire career in the military. The first is the medics, because if you haven't realized this yet, you're in the infantry and you need to be friends with medics, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, I got to call my mom, you know, this is scary. But then the second, he said supply. And I was like, supply? I don't understand supply. Why would I need to be best friends with them? Because I was always told that the Army's going to give me everything I'm ever going to need, right? It's wrong. And he said, you be best friends with supply because they be the ones that make sure you have toilet paper when you need toilet paper. Oh, okay. Okay, so I kind of use that example not to, correlate volunteer services to toilet paper, but they're really that supply, right? They give us the volunteers. The better relationship that we have with them, they're going to be able to identify our needs, what we want, because we don't want to be in a situation where we really need something, right, and they're not able to give it to us because we didn't have that relationship built up, right? You don't want to be in a situation where you really need toilet paper and you don't have it, right? It's the same thing with volunteer services. You don't want to be in a situation where you have no volunteers to respond. That's like our biggest nightmare. We just can't respond because we don't have the volunteers. And then we go to volunteer services, and they were like, you never asked. I never heard from you. I don't have that relationship with you. So again, I love volunteer services. But so next I'm going to show you guys just some tools and resources. First with onboarding and placement, so I'll give you guys a brief example. Again, with workforce engagement, there's a lot of different ways to do it, right? There's more than one way to figure it out. What works for my region might not work for you guys, it might, but feel free to take these ideas, adapt them, change them, throw them out, throw them away. Every region's different, right? Geography, volunteers that we have, size, scope, scalability. So feel free to take some of these ideas, either implement them, think about them, change them, all that stuff. But anyway, so with onboarding and placement, what my region does is we do a regional entry point for all new disaster volunteers. Okay, so whether they're a prospective DAT volunteer, a prospective nurse, a prospective smoke alarm installer, a shelter volunteer, anybody that comes to disaster services gets referred from volunteer services to the same entry point, right? We have one volunteer that is my onboarding and placement lead, and she manages the entire process, right? From interviewing all new volunteers, approving them, assigning them their training requirements, finding out what their interests are, right? Putting them on their initial path for their engagement, and helping them with that initial process, right? And it works, okay? It's probably not what we're going to stay with long term, but again, we're kind of in that mindset of we have to flip the house as we're living in it. I don't know if you guys have ever flipped houses, but it's a lot easier to flip a house if you don't live in the house, right? You can just gut everything and just tear it all out. When I have 3 children, I cannot do that. I have to choose one room at a time, be very planned, and maybe make one room work, make it livable, right? But until I have time to work on that room, it's just going to have to work how it is, right? But at least it's working, okay? That's the same thing with workforce engagement. We're living in the house as we're trying to flip it, which makes it harder, but maybe our initial plan is making it work now, and it's not what we're going to stay with, for the next year or two, right? But at least now we're getting new volunteers referred to us every day. If we didn't have some initial entry point, how are we going to onboard them? How are we going to engage them? How are we going to interview them? All that stuff. So anyway, and again, this goes back to relationship with volunteer services. I found this amazing volunteer because I communicated with volunteer services, and I had that ongoing, every week we would just touch base how things are going. And they asked me, what's the one thing you really, really need? And I was like, well, if I don't onboard new volunteers very well, nothing else matters, right? That's kind of the foundation of everything. If you're not continually getting new volunteers in the pipeline, everything else is going to eventually kind of crumble. You kind of have to always have that fresh blood, right? So they found me a really good onboarding and placement volunteer that came over from SAF as a caseworker. She had more availability, more time. And she developed this amazing spreadsheet that we use to track every volunteer's engagement. And it's a lot to take in at first, but let me share this with you guys. All right. Can everybody see this? Wait, it's connecting. There we go. Can everybody see the spreadsheet?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. So this is, do you want me to zoom in? Can you guys read it very well?
It's good.
It's okay.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So we try to make it as simple as possible, but she tracks this spreadsheet. And again, We're not wanting to overcomplicate the process. It's very simple. It's very readable. This is a spreadsheet of all the volunteers that she interviews and approves. It tracks the date they were approved, the staff they were assigned to, if they had a mentor assigned to them, their initial interest, when she sent the welcome email, if they returned their health status record, if they got their ID badge, if there was a license associated with the volunteer, the trainings that were assigned, if they completed their trainings, any gaps, so on and so forth, right? This came in really, it was really beneficial to have this when we had the crazy fall, right? Because all of a sudden it's like, here's 300 people, track them, right? And it was like, okay, now we got to track 300 different people. How do we do that? So it's a very simple process. What we do, we have 3 chapters in our region, and every month, each chapter, so myself, my team, the chapter volunteer specialists, so volunteer services in that chapter, and also the disaster staff and the disaster leadership volunteers in that chapter, we have a conference call where all we do is we go name by name of all the new volunteers that we've received so far this fiscal year. Right? Where are they at? How are they getting involved? How are they getting engaged? Because that way the supervisors can say what they're doing. Volunteer services can say, hey, I heard from this person. They haven't heard from anybody in a couple months. How can we help with that? Or it could be the disaster staff and the supervisors say, I've reached out several times and I haven't heard back. Right? We look at if they've completed their trainings, all that stuff. And again, it's just name by name. Once a month, we go through it. And then we have a simple color coding system, right? I'll kind of go over to our table of contents section. All right. So green means they're fully engaged, right? They're ready to rock and roll. Yellow, they've taken some classes, they've maybe went to a meeting or two, but we don't feel like they're self-sufficient yet in their volunteer experience. So we need to keep an eye on them. Red, it's kind of like a warning. We haven't heard from this person. We have no idea. They haven't taken any classes. We don't know what they're doing, right? And purple is we either rejected the referral or we inactivated them, right? One culture shift that it was difficult for us to transition, but we're very happy we transitioned is, time is very hard for us to have. So much work to do, not enough time to do it. We would hold on to new volunteers for a couple of years, right, in our system and reach out to them dozens of times before we would inactivate their profiles, right? We don't have time for that anymore. Okay, so once we initially onboard them, once we initially engage them, we provide them with the initial tools that we want them to. If they, in 3-4 months, if they haven't gotten back to us or done anything, and we've reached out to them multiple times, phone and email, we inactivate them, right? And it's very simple to reactivate them. If they ever get back to us the day we inactivate them and say, hey, I'm inactivated, what happened? It's like, okay, well, boom, you're reactivated. I clicked a few buttons. Let's get you involved again, right? That all goes back to how do you keep clean data versus dirty data, right? Are your lists accurate? Are they not accurate? And again, for new volunteers, the majority of the time when people sign up to volunteer with the Red Cross, it's just not going to work out, right? How many times in my life have I overpromised and said, yeah, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll do that, I'll do that, but I really don't have time for it. And when it comes down to it, I'm not able to actually meet that commitment, right? It's the same thing with new volunteers. You got to provide the initial tools, the initial process, the initial way that this new volunteer can get engaged. And at the end of the day, it's up to them, okay? So kind of to go back to this, again, green, fully engaged, yellow, somewhat engaged. And then purple, that's people that we inactivated, right? And as you can see, a lot of these people did not complete any trainings, right? Um, and then we just kind of scroll down the list. We got some reds in there. We have some yellows, but for the most part, I feel pretty good about this. Initially, I was like, wow, we're only keeping about 40 to 50% of our people. That's awful, right? But after I talked to volunteer services and some people at national headquarters, they said that's really, really, really good, because normally it's like 5 to 10%. That's like the rough national average. If a new volunteer signs up with the Red Cross, we keep about 5 to 10% of them, right? So if I'm doing about 40%, that kind of tells me that average can be bumped up a little bit, with just a little bit of effort, a little bit of work, a little bit of consistency, communication, being timely to new volunteers. You can have people stick, right? And again, this goes back to what can we do that works now to give us time to build for the future, right? It goes back to as you're flipping your house as you're living in it, right? How can you make this house livable while you have time to go room by room and build for the future? So this is a really nice spreadsheet. It's kind of helped us keep track of everything. There's a lot of new volunteers that come in from each different chapter, and we all use this spreadsheet. One thing that we did that was a really slick idea from my training lead was we numbered all of the trainings, right, that we have in disaster services, all of the classes, right? DCS overview is numbered 1, psych first aid is numbered 2, shelter fundamentals numbered 3. So in this spreadsheet, we run a report every month on Edge to look at who's taken classes, right? All the volunteers that's taken classes. And my onboarding and placement team goes through that, and they look at all the new volunteers that are on that report to see what classes they've taken, and they just add the corresponding number to the training or the completed training column, right? So I could look back at a new volunteer that was Ellen Shank, who was approved on the 5th of this month. She's already taken courses 1 through 6. So if I go to that, she's taken DCS overview, psych first aid, shelter fundamentals, casework and recovery planning fundamentals, everyone's welcome, and direct client assistance fundamentals, right? That tells me, okay, it might work out for her. I think she's going to be a good one, right? All of this stuff is in Volunteer Connection, but instead of searching through Volunteer Connection on all these different sites, we just consolidate it in one spreadsheet. So we can get a clear-cut look, is this person engaged or not, right? And then every month we go name by name, have that conversation, and then we just agree on a color. Is she green? Is she yellow? Is she red? Do we inactivate her? And then we just have a consensus, and then we go on to the next name. And we just keep it up to date that way. It works. It might not be the best long-term, but it works for us for now. So that's kind of what we do with onboarding and placement. I have a few sample emails that my onboarding and placement lead sends, and I believe you guys have a copy of that. That's just a sample email that pretty much our onboarding and placement lead, after she does the interview, right? So as she's talking to the new volunteer about their interest, whether it's DAT, health service, mental health, so on and so forth, she gives them the trainings they need to take and then tells them, I'm going to be sending you an email here in a few minutes that's going to tell you to do these things, right? And it's very simple. Take these classes, get a health status record, fill it out, turn it back in, and reach out to your DPM or DPS, try to get engaged. Someone will be in contact with you, right? Just very clear-cut, step by step. Let me pull that up. So that's at the onboarding and placement. One thing that we figured out that took us a while to figure it out, but we realized that it's great to have this regional entry point and this spreadsheet that we can track everything, but people were still falling through the cracks, right? So we looked at why are they falling through the cracks, and a lot of it is just because there's nobody local to engage them, right? the best Red Cross offices, the best Red Cross teams are teams that have a local visibility, whether it's an office or it's, you know, a team of existing volunteers that have been doing it together for 10 plus years. They meet regularly. Those are the best teams, right? But sometimes you don't always have that, you know. So people were falling through the cracks. Man, we have volunteers that come in, and the next closest volunteer to them is like 2 hours away, right? How do you engage somebody like that at a regional level? So we developed what we call engagement mentors. Really, they're just a local workforce engagement volunteer. That their job is to, okay, this new volunteer gets onboarded, they get this welcome email with these trainings, here's their initial area that they chose that they want to get involved in. How can we, our job as a mentor is to take the information, take that stuff, get the volunteer active, right? So this is just a simple handbook that I have, and let me pull it up. I think this might be it. Might be a different one. Yep, it's right here. All right, so this is my mentor handbook. This is a scanned copy. I didn't print any out for you guys, but I can email this to you guys so you guys can use it. This is pretty much a guide for local workforce engagement volunteers to get new volunteers engaged, right? It just includes, it's very simple, step-by-step directions of what they're supposed to do and a bunch of tools and resources that they can use to hand out to new volunteers, right?
We
It's
can
very
only
simple.
see, I don't know if you see that on your end, but we can only see section 1, welcome, and 2.
Yep. Oh,
Okay.
really?
Yeah.
Let me, can you guys see it now?
No, hang on. Let me see if this helps. Actual size, maybe? Oh, wait, nope.
How about that?
Nope, now we just see section 1.
Can you guys see as I'm scrolling?
Yeah, something happened.
Okay. So after section 1, we have a welcome letter. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
That's just, not to read it to you, but that's just an official welcome letter that from me to the mentor that welcomes them to the role, briefly explains over what the new role is, what they're doing, and what the handbook's for, and if they have any questions to contact me. Okay. Next is a job description, right? Volunteers love job descriptions. This is a job description that goes over the purpose of a local workforce engagement mentor or a team member, their narrative of responsibilities, skills and knowledge, their training experience, relationship management, and development opportunities. Okay. Next is the mission statement. We like that. We like to talk about the mission because whenever we stop talking about the mission on a regular basis, it'll steer us down paths that we're not going to be able to, it's going to be hard to kind of pull away from. We're doing stuff that's not related to the mission at all. After that is pretty much just the table of contents. Can you guys all see this?
Yep.
Okay. So this is what the handbook is. Section 1 is just a welcome and who we are. It consists of that welcome letter that I said, the job descriptions, the responsibilities, and the mission statement. Section 2 is just our region, right? And this is for reference for the mentor. It gives we're going to be going over a brief model of disaster services, our table of organization that's good for the mentor to have, and a map, right? What is our regional boundaries? What does our region look like? How does my chapter or my territory fit into the region, right? Section 3 is getting started. Just going over a basic roadmap for the mentor and how to accomplish their job. A face-to-face meeting template. That's just a brief handout on when you meet with a new volunteer face-to-face, you know, what are some questions that you should ask? The internal template, email and external template. So just to help with consistency and communication, you guys should have the example of the external email template. So that's what my onboarding and placement lead, her name's Carol Mitten. That's what she sends the new volunteer. But also there's a second email, right, that she sends. That's the internal email. Okay, so she sends that to everybody else involved, DPMs, DPSs, disaster paid staff, volunteer services, other volunteers, the mentors, and that briefly highlights the new volunteer, their interests, their availability, all that stuff. And then last we have a checklist. And then in section 4, this is just a big tools and resources section of all the different paperwork that they might need as they're meeting with the new volunteer. They can pull out a health status record and say, hey, have you filled this out yet? The new volunteer says no, and says, okay, fill it out and get it back to me. Here's the gap chart. Have you seen this? Go over that. Here's a brief cheat sheet on how to enter your hours. Have you entered your hours? Here's a brief cheat sheet on how to update your availability to deploy, right? That's a take-home for them. If there's any DAT paperwork and all that stuff that we'll get into. So just to kind of comb through this again, section 2 is the region. Can't really see that, but that is a map. Let me rotate that. That's the model, Disaster Cycle Services model. They spend about 5 minutes going over this with new volunteers. Again, one thing that I had to hold my feet to the fire on is I get really excited, right? And I want to just throw everything that I can at new volunteers, and it's almost overwhelming, right? I use this analogy a lot. So I'm a food guy. So I was asking you about your food. I love food. And I always use food analogies, it seems like, and I get made fun of for it. But I think it makes sense. I really, really do. So pretend we own our own restaurant, right? Disaster Services is the restaurant, right? And all of the different menu items are all the different opportunities, okay? And it's not like our traditional restaurant where we serve traditional foods, right? It is just some far off exotic restaurant that we serve foods that people haven't even tried before, right? They've never heard of this stuff, right? So as people come in to the restaurant and they want to, and we give them the menu, if we just say, okay, and we give them a menu, and we don't just say, pick something, we tell them, pick something that you want to eat every day for the next couple months, and you've never tried it before, right? Sometimes it works best if we own the restaurant and the new person comes in, they haven't tried this stuff, and we want them to pick an area. Maybe we can simplify it for them as much as we can, right? Maybe we can just give them a few of our more high, our items that people like to do a lot, right? Instead of giving them the 50 different options, give them the 4 or 5 that everybody else seems to order, right? Have them choose from that. Maybe have somebody else, so maybe have the chef come out and talk with them about what they're eating, what the food is, right? The chef in this instance is other disaster volunteers, disaster paid staff supervisors that can come out and say, this is what my job is, right? This is what my position is. This is what I do here. To help that new volunteer make a better informed decision, right, of what they want to do, versus just saying, here's the menu. They got choose a gap, choose an operational state role, a steady state role. Here's everything. I would spend 4 or 5 hours with new volunteers when I first started, going over all the gaps, all of the steady state roles, operational state roles, and the next day they might remember what DAT stands for, right? So be as simple as possible, be as clear as possible, provide maybe not all of the vast opportunities in the Red Cross world to them, but just a couple. And sometimes it works out if you got a new person that comes in and says, hey, I really want to do anything. Then maybe we should decide, right? Okay, I want you to focus on DAT, and I want you to do that. Let me know if it works out, right? And then have that conversation going on. So then after this, we kind of just have it goes over the disaster cycle services model. I'm sure you guys might have seen this document before, but it just gives some people a brief intro into what disaster services is. That's a map of my region, which is sideways. I'll fix that for you. I mean, to give you guys a headache. This is good to give new volunteers, right? They like to see what their chapter looks like, what the region looks like, how big it is, where your office is, where the closest offices are. That helps, right? So section 3 is getting started, and this is very simple. This is my roadmap for my engagement mentors. So this is just a step-by-step guide of what they are supposed to do, right? First thing they do is they receive that internal email, okay? Next thing they do is they reach out to the new volunteer. After that, they have the face-to-face meeting with the new volunteer. After that, they let Carol and everybody else know how the meeting went, right? They do a 15-day follow-up with the new volunteer to see how things are going. They do a 30 to 60-day follow-up as well. And then at that point in time, hopefully, the new volunteer's orientation checklist is complete, right? So we're looking at in 60 days from the minute they're approved, they've completed all their initial trainings, and they've done their checklist. And I'll show you guys the checklist pretty quick. This is just a basic template of the questions that the mentor or the local workforce engagement person would ask a new volunteer locally, right? Why did you join the Red Cross? What's your previous job experiences? You know, briefly go over the conversation the new volunteer had with Carol at a regional level. You know, the worst thing that we do with new volunteers is we ask the same questions over and over and over and over again, right? Because we don't communicate, okay? A lot of times volunteer services figures all this stuff out for us, right? But if we're not having that conversation, then we're asking again, what are you interested in? You know, and then, you know, the new volunteer says, you know, someone's asked me that 5 or 6 times, and it's always been a different person. And that tells the new volunteer, you guys really don't communicate, which is true, right? So try to be cognizant of that as you guys are developing your onboarding and engagement process. Again, this is just a nice little template that I can send you guys. So after that, here's an example of the internal email, and it's very simple. It's sent to all the internal Red Cross parties, right? The disaster staff, local mentors. Also included is the EDGE lead. We have a regional EDGE lead that all the trainings that a new volunteer is asked to take, she assigns them all to their EDGE accounts, right? So the new volunteer doesn't have to go in and search and request 7 or 8 different classes, and it's always confusing if anyone's ever gotten on EDGE. It's really confusing to find the right class and request it. So our EDGE lead, Helen Blank, will go in to every new volunteer and assign those courses to their trainings to do, and so it's all in one section. So the new volunteer goes on, here's their 7 or 8 classes they take, and they take all of them. And that just goes over, again, just to be brief, right? Their name, the date they were approved, where they're at, the location, what their email is, what their work and experience is, what their availability is, right? That would tell the local mentor, when is this person available, when I can call them. Any other interests, other notes, and then the trainings assigned. And again, we kind of have that fancy numbered system, right? So we can assign 1 through 9. So you're not typing out 9 different courses. It bothers me to type that much. It really does. I like this number thing. So again, that's an example of the internal email. This is what you guys have, I believe, or it's similar to this. This is a copy of the external email. So a new volunteer receives this, right? It goes over their training. It gives them the EDGE information. It goes over the classes they need to take, ID badge. And what are the attachments? We attach a map. We attach a health status record for them to fill out. and we attach a training guide, which I'll get into. And that kind of helps them, spell that out. So this is kind of fuzzy, but this is the new disaster volunteer orientation checklist. It's a very long name, but this is pretty much what we would like all new volunteers to have completed before that 60-day mark, right? It's a lot to ask, but this is what we would like all new volunteers to do. One is fill out a health status record, right? That's a big one. 2, they complete their initial trainings. 3, they get their ID badge. 4, they've updated their availability to deploy if they want to. 5, they've had hours submitted. And 6, this is the big kicker, they've met with their local supervisor or paid staff. That one's a hard one to do because we don't have supervisors everywhere, right? That's hard, But that's the big kicker that a lot of people aren't able to do just because there's no local supervisor, right? But if every new volunteer, or a lot of them, can accomplish these first 5 things, they've entered hours, they've taken classes, they've got their ID badge, they've updated their availability, they filled out their health status record, that, to me, is a super successful onboarding and engagement pathway for new volunteers, right? And again, try to be as simple and clear-cut as possible, right? One region, Kansas, Nebraska, does this really, really well, and I kind of like it, and I might steal it. And that's what we do when it comes to good ideas and workforce engagement. We steal other people's ideas. But for every new disaster volunteer that comes in, because they get a lot, they get about double that what I get. They don't have the time to give every new volunteer this much attention. So they tell every new volunteer, take disaster cycle services and overview online. That's it, right? And that weeds out about 50% of the people, right? And that tells the region, you're responsive, I can trust you, and you're getting back to me, you're able to log on, you're able to take a class. So that kind of, I guess, gets rid of the people that, we would be wasting our time with because it's just not going to work out. And I get that. It makes sense. And it allows us to, okay, you took that, you got back to me, you took it in the first couple of weeks. Now let's talk about your onboarding, your engagement. Let's get you involved, right? That helps. So then after that, here's the tools and resources. Again, you guys have all seen, and this is just in the manual. They have like a dozen copies or so. Health status records for them to hand out in person. That's always good to have in person. That's kind of sideways, but that's the gap chart. It's always a good tool to have, even though it confuses me half the time. This is really nice. This is just a simple cheat sheet that I created, and I can share it with you guys. A step-by-step guide on how to update your availability with nice little screenshots, right? So it includes step 1 is go to Volunteer Connection. Step 2 is log on to Volunteer Connection. Step 3 is go to your profile, a big red arrow. Step 4 is click on Disaster Responder. And it just goes on how to update your availability, right? And then the next one is similar. It's how to log your own hours, right? Even though it's simple, a lot of people don't know how, and I get confused on it half the time too, actually. So it's easier to just hand out this resource. It's a simple step-by-step. 1, log on to Volunteer Connection. Click on the Submit Your Hours button. This is what it looks like, and then it kind of spells out what to fill in, right? What to put in what section, how many hours, and here's an example, okay? And then lastly, I just have some client consent to share information, basically all the DAT paperwork. A lot of our new volunteers, we push towards DAT because there's not a whole lot for them to do day to day, right? They say they want to do logistics. They say they want to do DST. That's great when it comes time to a disaster, but how do we keep you engaged now, right? I don't have a whole lot of DST stuff going on, in our entire 78 county region, right? Maybe you can do DAT, locally to keep you involved, and we'll work towards getting you your DST gap long term and get you involved in that when the opportunity comes up. Again, it's being realistic, trying to set our new volunteers up for success versus setting them up for failure, right? If I send somebody on the pipeline from my team saying, okay, you want to do DST, I have 2 DST volunteers in my region, right? And they don't do DST day to day. That would be setting them up for failure, right? So is there any questions about this handbook that anybody has?
You said you're going to email that to us?
Yes, I can do that.
I have a question on one of the comments you made. 5 to 10% is kind of the rate of volunteers that stick with it.
Yep.
Has there been any study or is there any data follow up with those who didn't stick with it to see what the stumbling blocks were?
You know, that's a good point. I've asked that myself, and personally, I think that they almost don't want to know, right? Because they're not ready to know yet. But yeah, to me, I think it's what I've done. The simplicity of it is key for new volunteers. That's how you get new volunteers to stick initially if they're going to stick. Simplicity, communicate with them directly, give simple, clear-cut directions of what they're supposed to do next, and make it so they can at least be successful, right? A lot of times, you know, it's hard for us to always have in-person trainings, right? We might not have a logistics class for 8 months, right? So if I get a new volunteer interested in logistics and I say, okay, here's the logistics classes to take, some of them are offered in person, and that's the only format. And then like, okay, well, when's the next class coming up? And I'm like, I don't know. It's a good question. But that's how you get involved, is you take this class that I don't know when it's going to be offered, right? So it's just being realistic with ourselves and realistic with the new volunteers. Give them options that they can do, whether it's online classes or if there are in-person classes or in-person activities locally to them. That kind of helps. But to answer your question is, I would love there to be some study on that. But yeah, I don't think they're ready to know, to open Pandora's box, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Any other questions on that? Okay.
We have about 15 minutes or so, just...
Okay. Next, I'm going to go over our training guide, which I have somewhere. I have it here. Let me pull it up.
Do you plan to talk about the deployment piece at all?
Sure. Do you guys want me to talk about deployments? Is that exciting? All right. So yeah, I'll talk about deployments. So in our region, when I started, we had this. It was set up that each disaster paid staff had counties, and they managed the deployments in those set counties, right? So part of my job is to take work off their plates, right? And deployments falls under that. So I developed what I would call deployment officers, okay? And their job is to pretty much handle the deployment piece of our volunteers in our region to the national DRs, right? And we've been doing this for about a year and a half now since I started. And we've grown it to the point where this past fall, which was crazy, right? My team handled that primarily by themselves. So all the other disaster paid staff and disaster leadership volunteers didn't have to worry about the deployments, right? They could focus on either deploying themselves or keeping, holding the fort down while everybody else deploys, right? Making sure DAT still function, making sure people still went to meetings and home fire campaign stuff still happened. So the issue with that is it's hard to have everybody work on the same thing at once, right? I have about 10 volunteers that are deployment officers that are spread out throughout my 78 counties, and they're all remote, right? Initially, it was what it looked like is it was just about 500 sticky notes on my desk and everybody's desks, right? But we were so remote, so far away, we couldn't work together. So we really embraced the whole OneDrive mentality, and there was some bumps, but it definitely worked out to where we have a very simple spreadsheet that we use, and we're able to track all the deployments that are happening. So we all know if someone's called somebody once or 10 times, we're not going to call them again to waste time like that. So I'll pull up the spreadsheet here. So this is an example of what we did in the fall. There's really 4 tabs in the spreadsheet, and we create a new one every quarter. Contacts made. So this tells us all the people that we called, right? The next is a list of volunteers that are on standby. Okay, so we run availability reports. We send out mass blast messages, and people let us know, hey, I'm available this date or right now. Here's my gaps. We're able to do that.
And do you pull these from Volunteer Connection, or you said there's phone calls as well?
Both, yeah. So we use different avenues. Some people update their availability. So we pull reports on Volunteer Connection. Some people don't update their availability. Some people will just email me or someone on my team saying, hey, I'm available. Let me know, right? And there's also people that we know don't do either, but if you call them, they're going to go, right? So we keep this list pretty accurate of people that are available, right? So we have the name of the people, the chapter, the gaps that they're qualified in, if they filled out their pre-assignment health questionnaire already, their available dates, right, when they're available, notes, phone number, member number, and then we just kind of go down the list and see when they're available, right? So we have a big list of people that were on standby, and as you can see, we started tracking it in the fall, and we just added to it as we go down. There's different dates.
Do you do this regularly, or when there's like an influx of disasters?
All the time. We have a spreadsheet that we have every quarter. So even if there's no disasters going on at this certain time, we're still working on the spreadsheet, adding names, right, to people. We're running availability reports. People get back to us and let us know. Like, for example, these nor'easters that hit you guys, right? A lot of them that are hitting you now again as well. We sent out a lot of emails before that and uploaded a lot of the information to people that we know are available, right now, and we put them on our standby tab. So that way, once the positions hit the door, we're able to make phone calls to people that we know are going to answer and say yes, versus just calling people all over the time.
How many people do you have who do nothing but enter data into spreadsheets?
Well, I don't have anybody that just does that. We have people that do that, but they do other roles as well. So, for example, I have a lot of my work.
For example, just take this availability information when it's taken off Volunteer Connection. How does that get entered into your spreadsheet?
Okay, so it would just be I have a Volunteer Connection lead who is in charge of really all of that and the expert. I could just simply ask her, hey, could you run availability report for me and upload all the people that are available into the spreadsheet to track that. She could say yes, great. If she says no, I don't have time, then I have other people that are my deployment officers that I could go to that has access to do that in Volunteer Connection, and they can run those reports.
But, and this is what I'm trying to understand,
Yep.
When you say uploaded, there's a lot of retyping involved, isn't it? Because you're uploading into an Excel spreadsheet, and that's not the same spreadsheet as you have.
Yeah, so pretty much what we do is just copy pretty much copy and paste the names, right? So you can run that availability report into an Excel format, right? And then copy those names, paste it onto this format, and we would just have their names, and then you can also copy and paste the gaps if you want, because that shows that as well.
So is this sheet going to encompass everybody with a gap?
Yep.
Okay.
So what is the advantage of doing this beforehand as opposed to running the availability report when you need to deploy somebody and calling them then?
Well, this way you can get their pre-assignment health questionnaire done beforehand, right? Because that's always a little bit of a kink in the chain of you can't assign them until they fill that out, right?
Do that over the phone with them.
You can, yeah.
Supposed to have the DR they're going to, and if they're filling it out on such and such a date, and they don't get called for another week to go, and oh, by the way, I tripped and fell and broke my ankle yesterday.
Well, then they would need to, yeah, if there's any new information, and even if that happened, then they would have to fill out technically a whole new health status record.
Right.
But yeah, if there's new information, we ask them, hey, you filled this out 3 days ago. Is everything still okay? Yep, okay. Then we're good. And then we assign them. So it really just, it helps. So that way, if we have this on a spreadsheet, right, and it's on OneDrive, I can access that the exact same time that 10 other people can access it, right? So the issue that we were having before is I would call a volunteer that everybody else would call, right? So we would waste our time calling the same people, right?
I think also, and sorry to interrupt, a fair disclaimer to the group, we don't have to adopt, what they use here,
I
but
was just wondering if there was an advantage.
What?
We do it a little bit different here because right now we have one person who does all the deployment, and then she has people who back her up, unless they're both going away at the same time. But in previous years, we used to have a team of people, and they would be on call for a week.
Yep.
They would monitor the deployments. It would be one person monitoring the deployments for the region for a week at a time.
What
There's
I
only one person working it, so I could see where this would work for you guys.
What I would say is probably helpful with this is it would save us that last minute scrambling when we have nor'easters coming in and David says the division wants us to stand up 3 jump teams, and then we're stuck with calling down people to see if they're available because they might not have updated their availability. Right. So I think having something like this could be beneficial because you don't have to be making those calls. Yep. It's already something that's been proactively interpreted and documented.
I think we're better off doing what we've been doing with the emails and the shift tools. It's a closer reaction time to the event than doing this.
Yep. Really, this is better. The standby tab is okay. It's good for us to use, but really it's better for us to use the deployed tab. Primarily, it helps us track who's assigned to what DR and who assigned them, right? If their mission card was loaded or not yet, if their pre-assignment health questionnaire was completed, that's a typo. If they've returned, if their evaluation has been returned, and if there's any follow-up notes, right? That's the best thing for this spreadsheet because, a lot of times if we're all working on this, and if something were to happen where I deployed like 10 people, right? But for some reason I have to leave, and maybe 4 or 5 of them, their mission cards aren't loaded yet, right? I can leave, and then somebody else can get on the spreadsheet and it's live and see exactly where I left off, and to be able to make sure that these people get their mission cards and all that stuff.
Just out of curiosity, during the fall hurricanes spate, how many volunteers from your region deployed?
Including including the new ones that we just trained, 300, about 300.
So you have a pretty robust volunteer base.
I would say we probably have, and that's also including back-to-backs, people that went from one DR, they came home for a couple of days, they went back to another one. We got about 800 to 1,000 disaster volunteers in our region, and about a little over 100 of that 300 were brand new volunteers. So if we're talking about existing volunteers, we had about 200 that we deployed, and then about 100 were ones that we trained, through like the just-in-time trainings, one day, and then we sent you. So.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Yep, no problem.
Of those one-day trainings, how many were you able to keep on into blue sky roles, if you know, off the top of your head?
We're still working on that. It's not as many as we would have liked, but it's still a lot more than what we normally see. So I would say our percentage of retention is higher, but the issue that we're coming across now is they just want to deploy. A lot of them, they don't want to do that. They don't want to do local stuff. They don't want to help out because they got that really fun, awesome disaster deployment experience first off the bat. They're just like, okay, call me when the next one happens, right? So that's what we're seeing a lot. But it did work out. We had a few weeks ago, we had a level 3 DR in our region, which was a flood. And we were able to staff the entire operation locally within our region. Because of a lot of the new volunteers that we had trained and deployed in the fall, we had a lot of new people that we used, which was good. But again, if you don't have level 2s and level 3 disasters in your region all the time, it's kind of hard to get, find stuff for people to do that just want to deploy.
So how would you handle that for folks that just want to deploy and they don't want to commit to a steady state?
Well, we're flexible and realistic. I mean, I know technically we want people to have a steady state and operational state role, but if it's okay, you just want to deploy, we just ask that you keep up to date on your trainings. Make sure we know who you are, so attend the occasional local meeting, stay in touch with us, and stay up to date with all the new stuff that comes out, right? Because even if they don't do DAT or do home fire campaign, when our region gets impacted, they'll be there, right? So that's probably not the most accurate answer that national headquarters wants me to say, but it's just the most realistic. I'm not going to ask volunteers to do something they don't want to do if they're willing to respond to a disaster for us.
Okay. I'm going to just pause for a quick second because it is 2 o'clock. So if anybody does want to scoot out, because I know there's some weather in the south, feel free to. I don't necessarily want to cut this short either, so.
There's nothing by us.
I talked to John Vale. He said they're doing fine.
And it hasn't started
Okay.
snowing according to my cell phone, so.
Great. Well, I just want to throw that out there. And
We've all been touching bases at home.
perfect. So I just wanted to put that option out there, and I want to be respectful of your time. So since it is 2 o'clock, if you do want to scoot out, go ahead. But I think there's some good conversations happening here. So Luke, if you're comfortable, we can definitely keep going.
Sure, definitely. So I would just reiterate, probably.
Sorry, Keith was one of our folks.
We had a conversation about deployment-only volunteers.
Yep.
There are some on the books, and are we going to enable that in the future? And this was a while ago, but the direction I got from David was no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People who will only deploy. We need steady state people. So those people who are in that status, we'll try to cajole them, but we won't make any new ones.
Well, I think we're throwing away volunteers.
Pardon?
He deactivated one of the best ones.
Yeah, I got the impression that we're going to flush out the system and not have any more. But if that's not the direction we're going to end up going in,
Lauren,
then
is
some
there
of our steps
anything
might
from
change.
national that says
This would be entirely disaster cycle service.
it wouldn't be, we wouldn't have anything to do with all of this?
We wouldn't get any direction on that.
Okay. Just,
And I would say the way that I convinced, because my RDO was under the impression of that as well, and the way that I convinced her was they agree to take trainings and to stay up to date with trainings. That's a steady state role. If they come to classes, they stay up to date with trainings. We don't have to force them to respond to a fire or install smoke alarms, but besides those two things, it's not a lot for people to do. Yeah, you can do shelter inventories, you can help with logistics stuff and inventory with that, but if they agree to take classes, right, so they can deploy next time, that's a steady state role, so we're okay with that, But again, I understand that point of view because we can't just keep getting these volunteers that want to deploy. But when it comes to DAT, that's the bigger need, and it always is. So we do have that conversation with them, and we ask them to do that. We say there's a really big need of DAT. And a lot of them have said yes, some of them have said no, but if they say no, if they agree to take trainings and still show up to meetings occasionally, then we still keep them.
So Luke, a question for you. For those folks that do only want to, I certainly can appreciate, if they are in a gap and they are attending relevant meetings and trainings, that is certainly engagement, as long as they're logging hours. As far as the position, what position are they in, and then who manages them, who pushes out the communication and makes sure that they are taking the refresh trainings and attending meetings?
Yeah, so we have just a general disaster volunteer position in Volunteer Connection that all disaster volunteers get no matter what. So that's the group share that I use to communicate to all volunteers, right? And depending on the gap, so if we're lucky enough to have a regional lead like in mass care or sheltering or logistics, every quarter I give them a list of all the volunteers in that specific gap that they're the lead of. Just says, hey, can you send these mass blast emails out to these volunteers just to update them on what are some changes in the gap, what are some changes in sheltering, new processes, new standards and procedures, paperwork, that sort of thing.
So using that example, so if you have like a logistics lead, are they just managing the people in steady state position? Like, does everybody in logistics have a logistics gap?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Yep. But necessarily, our logistics lead isn't the highest ranking person in logistics in our region, right? So she's a logistics supervisor, and we have a few logistics managers that have that gap in our region, but she's the regional lead for logistics, so to speak,
like
right?
Blue Sky.
In Blue Sky. And then if a disaster happened in our region, she might be the AD logistics, she might not, right?
So to sort of follow that to a logical conclusion, if we decide we want to allow people to be response only, we could give them a position of general disaster volunteer or something, name somebody the leader of the general disaster volunteers, and they would have, and that would constitute a steady state position.
I mean, these are things that we would have to talk to David about. I don't know.
Sure,
yeah. Something we'd be able to adopt or not.
Yeah, and there's a big, not necessarily a change, but there's a lot coming down the pipeline with steady state positions and operational state positions that I'm not really very, understanding very well. It confuses me. So that's supposed to happen sometime this fiscal year, and we'll get more clarity on that. But and that also goes into the DAT migration, which you guys might be aware of, the DAT standardization. That's going to go into steady state DAT, operational state DAT. What does that mean? So, yeah. Any other questions or anything else you guys want to talk about? Okay.
For your deployment people, are they territory specific, or are there just 10 people remote that can deploy anyone from anywhere in the region?
Yes. They're regional volunteers that can deploy anybody in the region. We do have a localized mission card inventory team, right? That is there to give them the mission cards to the volunteers. But besides that, everything that does remotely. So they can handle the entire region with just doing call down and calling people and that sort of thing.
And do they take shifts at all, or are they just assumed to be on call unless otherwise noted?
So yeah, they do. So we have a deployment officer lead, and he's kind of not necessarily always on call, but obviously positions don't always hit the door. But when they do, and if it's big enough, then we'll get together and we'll set, okay, let's have a shift. let's schedule some stuff of, who's covering what day and who's watching the door what day. So right now, nobody's in essence on call because there's nothing on the door. But if something big and bad were to happen, then we would react to that and say, okay, let's, or if we expect something big to happen, then we would get some shifts available.
Okay.
Yep.
How do you handle getting the mission cards to the people deploying?
Oh gosh, that's a great question.
You have an answer?
We have issues with that because that's hard because, as you saw, our region is very remote, and we have offices not in every county,
Yeah.
So a lot of times we're really pushing on giving people mission cards ahead of time, and we do FedEx them overnight a lot of times. So that's our main way to get them there. But it is a struggle. And we don't have the magic answer to that because, it's tough.
When you did.
Yeah. But really what's worked really well is getting them the mission cards ahead of time, right? So sending out those mass blast communications, hey, here's the people that are available for the next 3 months, right? Do you guys all have mission cards? If not, let me know, and then I can get you those mission cards.
Hold on. So you're 3 months worth. So you have 3 months worth of volunteers that you're pre-issuing mission cards that are not activated. Is that correct?
Yeah, but it could be a volunteer could have a mission card for 6-7 months before they deploy, or a year, or 2 years.
And
They don't expire. They
Yeah.
expire 1 month from the end of the month after they were activated.
and they don't have a value until they're actually, we send that activation email. So pre-positioning is actually kind of ideal. We just don't talk about.
We position.
We do. We definitely do. We just don't do it as much as we could. But again, I think that's another kind of benefit of this. And again, I'm not saying that we should do something like this, but I think it gives us a little bit more insight and pre-planning. So when you do pull the trigger, all of the ducks are kind of in a row. And you have, if it's a centralized point, you can have multiple people working on it, and that's kind of a nice benefit as well. Okay. Anybody else have questions about any of this or any of the other parts of the process that he might not have been able to cover?
Yeah, there's a lot. Obviously, recognition appreciation is a big one. Volunteer connection management, leadership development, those are all exciting. Just real quick, I'll go over my training guide. That is a really handy document that helps not just new volunteers, but also existing volunteers understand and have the opportunity to find classes and take classes and know what's required for what. Let me open that up real quick.
Did you have us print that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
It's the big one.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
Is it based on the new learning path matrix or whatever they're calling it?
Yes, it was, until I found out there's a lot of issues with the learning path matrix, a lot of typos. So it is up to date as much as it can be.
Just one.
But there might be a few tweaks.
Okay.
So the good thing about this, and you can't see it there, but it's a nice little document. But for all the classes that we have, there's the embedded links to those online classes.
Nice.
Right? So if I'm a volunteer and I have this document open on my computer, I see disaster cycle services and overview. I click on this link and it takes me to Edge to log in, and then it has the class right there to launch. Right? That helps. So again, in this pathway, so this document's very big. The first page, a cover page. The second page is just my table of contents, all the stuff I have in there. Third is the map of the region and contact information. That's nice. Fourth is all of our systems, right? A link to Volunteer Connection, a link to the Exchange, a link to Edge, a link to CAS, a link to the IT customer portal, and just some general information for disaster volunteers. This training document has kind of turned into our volunteer handbook, so to speak, for our region. It just kind of gives a lot of good information and resources. Next is our initial training pathway. So kind of to go back to setting new volunteers up for success, we give them a few options to choose from for their initial direction to be involved, not all of them, right? So all new volunteers have to take these Part 1 classes, which are these first 4 classes, online, if they can. We offer them in person, a lot of different volunteer orientations throughout the region. And then Part 2 is they pretty much pick and choose a gap, and also if they want to do DAT, they do DAT. Right? So that's Part 1 and Part 2. It's clear cut. It's nice little X's and boxes to give people an understanding of what's required for what gap. And it has the numbers associated over here that I liked. Right? So after that, we do have just the gap chart. That's nice. Nice little resource. And after that, this is the best thing. Edge information and most common issues in Edge, right? Kind of gives you how to troubleshoot on your own, instead of, constantly just being frustrated because Edge never works, right? So this has saved a lot of phone calls and emails to IT, and a lot of volunteers that are happy just by having some simple, clear-cut directions. Here's some most common issues, right? And then we go into the training guide and all the gaps and what's required for what gap, right? So I have sheltering. This is Mass Cares, the group. The activity is sheltering. There's a link to the toolkit on the Exchange, so if they want more information, they can go there. And we just do service associate and supervisor. Okay. And here's all the links to the classes, if they're online or in person.
How do you, on the link for the in-person classes, are you just linking to the event and then they can see all the sessions?
Yep. So the in-person is linked to our volunteer connection training calendar that they can go to see if there's any upcoming classes. And then it just goes through, Mass Care is one group. Next is Recovery, the Generalist, right? And here's some other ones. We have to update that because I think Recovery just changed again. Individual Disaster Care. There's some trainings. And for Mental Health and Health Service, we have the education, licensure, credentials information, which is nice. And it just goes through all the gaps, right? It needs to be updated because there's been a lot of new classes that have been released the past couple months that we need to update this on. And then after that, towards the bottom, it goes into additional activities and disaster services. This is like more of the blue sky roles, right? Here's what's required for preparedness. You can be an Edge administrator. You can be a basic instructor. Here's what's required for basic instructor. A deployment officer, right? Here's what's required for that. Casework follow-up volunteers, and here's what's required for that. And then last we have our acronyms, which is nice. And especially if we're giving this to new volunteers, this is pretty much where they can go to answer a lot of their initial questions, right? What does DAT stand for, right? That's a big one. So that's kind of the training guide. I did get a lot of this from Minnesota, but feel free to adapt this, change it, create your own. The biggest benefit for this has been having, for the online classes, having a link to those classes and having them all together. That's this just very simple, very easy to use for our volunteers.
Who gives this out and when and how?
Yep. So Initially, it's given out to every new volunteer when they're approved, right? So they get this in that welcome email as an attachment. Also, I have my DPMs and DPSs give it out as much as they can. It's included in, we have a monthly newsletter, and the link to this is included in the newsletter. And we pretty much push it in every way possible. Because it's good not just for new volunteers, but also existing volunteers, right? But, yep.
Okay. All right. So does anybody else have questions? Is that all this?
No questions? Alrighty. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
You're the nicest people from New York I've ever met. No, but really thank you guys. And again, I've done several of these talks to different regions, and a lot of this stuff could work for you. All of it won't work for you. You know, every region's different. Every structure's different. A lot of what we've developed is because of the volunteers that we have, right? If I didn't have one amazing rock star onboarding and placement lead, I wouldn't have had one volunteer do it all, right? So as you're thinking about developing this workforce engagement team in these 7 functions, sometimes what you want isn't necessarily feasible because you don't have the volunteers for that. So look at the volunteer base you currently have and develop and make something that works. That's what we're doing, and we're constantly tweaking it. It's not the best. It's a work in progress as always, but in the military, I was a lot. The worst decision is no decision, right? And that's kind of what I think of with this is if you have an idea, try it. If we're constantly in this brainstorm idea phase and we're never into implementation phase, we're going to be just constantly spinning our tires in the mud, you know. So don't be afraid to try something, because normally what I've found out, if I give as much power and authority into my volunteer team and they develop this stuff, it's going to work, right? If I just think of stuff, it normally won't work because my volunteers think and see things that I don't see, right? So I would just empower you all and just, you know, definitely say that you guys might not think you have a very good idea or your idea won't work, but you'd be surprised. You know, a lot of this, we try to overcomplicate it, but it's pretty simple when you get down to it. So, alrighty. Well, thank you all. And I'll email all this to Julie and just send her like dozens and dozens of documents, and she can sort through it all for you guys. Sounds good?
Oh, she's definitely ready for that.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.